Hello, Shawnee Alliance. It's Pastor Chris. I don't have a ton of updates for you. Like I said yesterday, we're running out of things to update. Really, it's just reminders and just being together and supporting one another as we go through this time. The updates, really quick. The reminders are that tomorrow on the 29th will be online only at 11 o'clock only. I encourage you to join us online, be part of that community. It was most evident on Facebook, where people were just interacting with one another. We were praying for one another. And I really encourage you, if you have Facebook, you can join us there live at 11 o'clock. Of course, that's facebook.com/Shawnee Alliance. And you can join a watch party. You can host a watch party, which is really neat because then you can interact with everyone, or you can just interact with the people you're in that watch party with. But either way, it's just an exciting time to be able to interact with one another. Many of you joined us on YouTube, and that's just youtube.com/Shawnee Alliance Church. Most of you should have received an email with all these links. If you didn't receive an email, you can reach out to us. We'll make sure you get added on the next rounds. And so that you know, the reason I'm really encouraging you to join us live is because a big part of our church is the community. And it's not the same when we do this digitally, but it's still really good. And I loved watching people be prayed for and sharing one another's burdens, and to just be able to reproduce in not the same way, and honestly not as good of a way, but to still be able to reproduce the community that we are building every single week at Shawnee Alliance Church. So I encourage you to join us at 11 o'clock. I think it'd be great. We're going to be celebrating, of course, what God has done in our church, what God is doing moving forward, and just take time to share in God's word together. So I would like to also share with you that Pastor Daniel's reception has been postponed. If you know Pastor Daniel, you know there's a big part of him that loves the idea of just finishing his last sermon and getting in the car with his wife and driving home. And I loved, he shared it with me. He said, "I will not be there early. I will be driving in with my family." And as a pastor, that's something you do very rarely, is to drive in with your family. So I'm very happy for him that he gets to begin enjoying that now, even before he moves into his new role as church member. We will celebrate him at a reception. The date's going to be planned later once the world gets a little bit more back to normal. And of course, we'll be able to celebrate with him in person, and that will be a good day. We're continuing our daily devotionals. We're not going to have one tomorrow on Sunday because we're going to have the sermon. But instead, throughout the rest of the week, Monday through Saturday, we'll continue in that. I'm reading to you from the second chapter of Judges, and the books of Joshua and Judges cover the transition from, first the beginning of Exodus, where the people are called out of Egypt, and then into the wilderness, and then the journey through the wilderness, landing in the promised land. And then, of course, Judges is where really the second generation, so if you think of the first generation as Moses and the second generation as Joshua, Judges records as Joshua dies, and the community continues to move forward and to figure things out with God. So really, we're in the third generation now since the Exodus. I'd like to read to you from the book of Judges, the second chapter. "The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, 'I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you.' When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord." It goes from there to the death of Joshua, and it talks about the generation that had been gathered to their ancestors, and this new generation grew up, and they knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Joshua and Judges record this time where things start going right for the people. Of course, in Egypt, they were slaves, and so everything was going wrong. And then in the wilderness, God provided in a very real way. But there are some themes, and maybe you catch them as you read Exodus and Joshua and Judges. The themes are things like the Israelites constantly complaining about what they had not being what they have. Well, before you took us out of Egypt, at least our bellies were full. Um, you led us here, and there's not enough water. I mean, couldn't we have died without being thirsty back in Egypt? And this constant theme of God's faithfulness and our forgetfulness. I think a lot of people don't realize that when you see someone in your life who has confidence in their faith, some of that is just devotion. That there's no rhyme, there's no reason to it. It's just devotion to a God who's almighty, whom we love. That's it. There's nothing more to be said about it. But a lot of our faith comes from building upon the promises that God is delivering on every day. When you read the scriptures and you realize that God has promised his presence and that his presence has never left us or abandoned us, and that that has been the constant motivating factor to continue in our faith, when we remember that, it's a lot easier to go through difficult times. It's a lot easier to process times like these where maybe we're lonely, maybe we're afraid, maybe we're scared. But the greatest problem with the Israelites wasn't that they didn't believe in God. The greatest problem with the Israelites is they kept forgetting how he was constantly delivering on his promises. And so they came into this new land that they inherited instead of honoring the God who brought them to this new land. Instead, they began to devote themselves to the deities and to the culture in which they were now transplanted. They found comfort in that. They found comfort in doing the things that their neighbors were doing to gain their own sense of security. You can't read the scriptures and divorce our culture and divorce how we see the world from them. And what I mean by that is we were born in a certain time. We were born into a certain generation. We were born into a certain set of circumstances. We have been raised by our families. We are raised within a certain culture. And so, for example, one of the things I remember just being a constant theme growing up is just rugged individualism. And there's a lot of me that loves that idea that I'm going to take care of myself and my family, and I'm going to be the person who has control of his own fate and his own destiny. But that is actually counter to what the Bible teaches us about dependence on God. See, God isn't meant to be something or someone that we honor when we score a touchdown in our own strength. He's the one whom we depend upon for our daily breath. And that's why I love the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. The idea that, God, you are providing for me in each and every way, every day. And when we start seeing God as the focal point of our faith and of our life, and we start seeing his constant completion of every promise, then yeah, faith is still just this devotion to God, but it's also this confidence built upon his goodness and how he has delivered time and time again on his promises. So the reason that faith helps us to get through worry isn't just because we feel the presence of God, although that's true, we feel the presence of God, and that presence means all the difference between panic and calm in a storm. But we also have gained confidence in him. So you have Moses and you have the Israelites, and then 3 generations later, well, really 2 generations later, the 3rd generation, they have forgotten God and they have forgotten what he did for Israel. But if we're really honest, we can go to the 1st generation and they were constantly forgetting what God had done. We can go to the 2nd generation with Joshua and they had constantly forgotten what God had done. And sometimes people like to say, oh, this godless generation. But even the generations we would look at that are interacting so mightily with God, they constantly forgot what God had done. Which is especially incredible knowing that these were cultures that were based around memory. You know, most people couldn't write, most people couldn't read. And so memory was so much better. You know, the printing press destroyed memory. Now it gave us the written word, it's worth it, you know, everything's wonderful. But you have to remember that by the time you were 12, you were really expected to have memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament if you were growing up as a young Jewish boy. So think about this. That even though their memories were so much sharper than ours, they couldn't remember not just 2 generations back, not just 1 generation back, but their very own generation, that these folks who were growing up into this promised land had remembered Joshua, who many of them had been alive for. They might have been children, a few of them, but many of them were very much alive and had good memory of Joshua defeating those who stood against God at Jericho, and the deliverance, out of Egypt, and understood what that should have meant, and that God was at the center of it, and yet we don't see that being reflected in the people. Sometimes we don't feel the presence of God. And mind you, that's not an absence of God. That's a failure to understand and to communicate on my part if I'm not feeling that. God's there whether I want to acknowledge him or not. When we feel that lack of presence, sometimes we need to start depending and relying on that God who has seen us through every situation, every bit of our past. And the most dangerous thing I see is when people forget how much God has already done. Now, if you're a new believer, that's hard because you haven't seen God fulfill those promises. Now, fortunately, we have the scriptures to show us what God has done throughout history, but it hasn't become real to us. But especially for those of us who are raising the next generation in faith, tell them the stories of what God has done. Help them to see God move in their own stories, the miracles that they would forget if not reminded. May we be a people who remember God's goodness so that in the midst of our questioning of what the best step is or whether or not to be afraid, we find our confidence in the presence and in the promises that God has kept. My encouragement for you today is if you find yourself with an abundance of time, maybe something we can do is to simply count on whether it be writing it down or going through our journals or whatever form you process such things. May we simply count the blessings that God has given us and the promises that he has answered, the goodness in our lives. Some of us have been delivered from much, and we can celebrate God for that. And some of us, God has protected us from many of the terrible things that people need delivered from, and we can celebrate him for that. Either way, God will be God. My choice is whether or not to remember just how good he's been. I look forward to worshiping with you online tomorrow. It's a blessing to be able to have that ability. And I think of 1918 when, a great pox broke out, and yet people couldn't worship. They didn't have this community. So I pray that you'll take advantage of that you will join us at 11 o'clock tomorrow online, and know that we're praying for you each and every day. And we have not stopped ministering. If you need help, please reach out to prayer@shawneealliance.com. We're checking that several times a day, making sure that people's requests and needs get forwarded to the right place. Have a blessed day, and I can't wait to worship with you tomorrow.